Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Think about the dashboard of your car for a second. A little gas pump lights up and you know you need fuel. Or the battery icon glows, you check the alternator.
Right, it's very straightforward.
Yeah, it's beautifully binary. But step into the clinical world of women's health and, well, that dashboard becomes incredibly complex.
Oh, absolutely. A single symptom can signal a dozen different pathologies. Or, it might just be a completely normal variation of human physiology.
Which makes it the ultimate test of diagnostic reasoning. You are constantly filtering signals through the context of a patient's age, their genetics, and their environment.
Exactly. You're never just looking at one isolated issue.
Right. So if you are listening to this right now, chances are you are a college nursing student staring down an exam on reproductive system concerns. And, well, consider this your personalized one-on-one clinical prep session.
We are taking a deep dive into Chapter 6 of Maternity and Women's Healthcare. So we'll be looking at the body's evolving relationship with estrogen and the whole female reproductive lifespan.
And we aren't just going to rattle off a list of disorders. Our mission today is to build the clinical reasoning that will help you walk into your exam and eventually onto a hospital floor, ready to provide safe, prioritized nursing care.
Yeah, we're going to track this chronologically, exactly how the chapter lays it out. We'll start with normal menstrual parameters, move into disorders like amenorrhea and endometriosis, look at abnormal bleeding patterns, and finally wrap up with the menopause transition.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the baseline, right? Because before a nurse can recognize pathology, they have to deeply understand what's considered normal.
Right, and that biological journey really begins with menarche, which is the first menstrual period. The average age of onset is 12.4 years.
But, as a nurse, you have to treat that number as a flexible benchmark, not a rigid rule, yeah.
Oh, for sure. It fluctuates based on genetics, socioeconomic status, and critically body mass index. And it also takes a surprisingly long time for the cycle to look anything like that standard 28-day textbook model.
Right. The system needs about 3 years to stabilize, which is a massive teaching point for young patients who might be terrified that something is wrong with them.
Exactly. Extreme irregularity is actually the physiological rule rather than the exception at the two extremes of reproductive life.
So, the first 2 years post-menarche and the 5 years right before menopause.
I got it. Those windows are notoriously erratic and often anovulatory, which means a missed period during those times requires a very different clinical lens than a missed period in, say, a 25-year-old.
So amenorrhea, the absence of menstrual flow, isn't a disease itself, it's a check engine light for the body, right?
That's a perfect way to put it. It's the body's way of signaling that something in the endocrine or systemic background has just derailed.
But there's a golden rule in nursing assessment here. Before we start looking for complex pituitary lesions or thyroid issues, you always check if the patient is pregnant first.
Always. A beta-HCG test is non-negotiable. You have to rule out the most common, benign cause before you go down the diagnostic rabbit hole.
Okay, but let's say that pregnancy test comes back negative. We start looking at the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis.
Right. And one of the most critical disruptions you'll see, especially in young women, is hypogonadotropic amenorrhea. And this is often triggered by the female athlete triad.
The mechanics of this are fascinating to me because it all really comes down to adipose tissue or body fat.
It does. The biological threshold to simply initiate menarche requires about 17% body fat. And then to maintain regular cycles, the body demands around 22%.
Wow. So when athletes engage in intense, low body weight sports like elite gymnastics or distance running, their fat reserves just plummet.
Right. The body perceives this physical strain and low energy availability as a starvation state. So the hypothalamus, which is the control center, essentially decides, hey, this is not a safe time to reproduce.
And it suppresses the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone.
Exactly. And without that initial hormone, the pituitary gland never gets the memo to release FSH and LH.
And if the ovaries don't get FSH and LH, they completely stop producing estrogen. But here's the clinical twist that I think catches people off guard. Why do sports like gymnastics or distance running specifically cause bone loss that looks like what we see in postmenopausal women?
It's a great question. The underlying mechanism relies on the relationship between estrogen and bone cells. Estrogen acts as the brakes on osteoclasts, which are the cells responsible for breaking down old bone.
So when estrogen disappears, those osteoclasts just go into overdrive.
Exactly. They devour the bone matrix way faster than it can be rebuilt. And that leads to premature osteoporosis in teenagers who are otherwise in peak physical condition.
That's wild. So the nursing intervention here relies heavily on counseling, not just meds. You have to help the patient identify stressors, modify those punishing exercise routines, and address restrictive eating behaviors.
Yeah. And because you're dealing with adolescents, this almost always requires parental input to help navigate these major lifestyle overhauls.
Right. Okay, so if the check engine light is off and the cycle is happening, it can sometimes bring debilitating pain and systemic symptoms that drastically affect a patient's quality of life.
Yes, we are talking about dysmenorrhea. And the clinical distinction a nurse has to make here is between primary and secondary.
So primary dysmenorrhea is purely biochemical, right? It usually shows up 6 to 12 months after menarche, once those ovulatory cycles finally establish themselves.
That's right. The main culprit is prostaglandin F2 alpha. During the luteal phase and menses, the endometrial lining breaks down and releases arachidonic acid, which converts into massive amounts of prostaglandins.
And those compounds basically tell the uterine muscle to contract to expel the lining.
Yes, but in primary dysmenorrhea, the body overproduces them. The uterus clamps down so aggressively that it actually chokes off its own blood supply.
Yikes. So that vasospasm creates localized tissue ischemia. And just like a heart muscle deprived of oxygen, a uterine muscle deprived of oxygen screams in pain.
Exactly. And those prostaglandins also leak into the systemic circulation, which is why patients don't just have cramps. They present with diarrhea, nausea, lower backache, and dizziness.
And then secondary dysmenorrhea is a different beast entirely. It develops later in life, usually after age 25.
Right, and it isn't just a biochemical misfire. It's tied to actual physical pathology, and it typically presents as a dull, lower abdominal ache, rather than those sharp ischemic cramps.
Okay, I want to look at pharmacology table 6.1 from the text regarding NSAIDs. NSAIDs are essentially the stop signal for prostaglandin production, right?
They are. They block the cyclooxygenase enzymes, which are basically the factory workers that build the prostaglandins.
But the nursing education piece here is crucial. If the factory has already produced the prostaglandins and flooded the system, taking an NSAID won't help much.
Right, which means NSAIDs like ibuprofen or naproxen are most effective if they're started several days before menses or at the very first sign of bleeding.
And the table highlights a critical clinical alert, too. You have to limit continuous use to 72 hours and educate the patient to report dark-colored stool, since that's a sign of GI bleeding.
Spot on. If NSAIDs fail after a 6-month trial, oral contraceptive pills, or OCPs, are the logical backup.
Because they stop ovulation and keep the endometrium from thickening in the first place. But what about non-pharmacologic interventions? Like Figure 6.1 shows the yoga triangle pose.
Yes, stretching the spine and pelvis physically alters the anatomical angle of the pelvis. It relieves pelvic congestion by draining stagnant blood.
And heat application and pelvic rocking work similarly to counteract that painful uterine ischemia, right?
Exactly. Now, Table 6.2 walks through herbal therapies, but there's a vital nursing alert here.
Oh, right. Nurses absolutely must ask about herbal use, like ginger or black haw during the assessment.
Yes. Patients just view them as natural teas, but they can cause significant drug interactions or increase bleeding risks. You cannot wait for the patient to volunteer that info.
Good to know. Now, the luteal phase doesn't just bring cramps. We also see PMS, right?
We do. But nurses need to draw a strict line between standard PMS, which involves physical and behavioral symptoms in the luteal phase, and PMDD.
PMDD being premenstrual dysphoric disorder, that's a severe DSM-5 psychiatric variant, right, with marked dysphoria and anxiety.
Exactly. It completely disrupts a patient's ability to function. Dietary interventions like increasing calcium, B6, vitamin D, and limiting salt and sugar can help.
But SSRIs like fluoxetine or sertraline are the FDA-approved first-line pharmacologic therapy for PMDD.
Yes, and they're often prescribed just during the luteal phase. Pulse dosing limits those long-term side effects.
Okay, speaking of secondary dysmenorrhea and severe pain, the major culprit a nurse will encounter is endometriosis.
Right, when tissue goes rogue. Endometriosis is the presence of endometrial tissue outside the uterus. Figure 6.2 shows sites like the ovaries, the broad ligaments, and even up into the thoracic cavity.
And the theory behind this is retrograde menstruation.
Yeah, blood and tissue flow backward through the uterine tubes during menses and spill into the peritoneal cavity. Because it's endometrial tissue, it still responds to hormone signals.
It thickens and bleeds, but the blood is trapped. which causes inflammation, scarring, and those chocolate cysts, which are just pockets of old blood on the ovaries. But does more tissue mean more pain?
You would think so, but no. A surprising clinical fact is that the extent of pain is absolutely not correlated with the severity of the disease.
Wow, that's counterintuitive. And this isn't just an adult issue, is it?
Not at all. It affects about 50% of teens who present with chronic pelvic pain.
So for pharmacologic management, the goal is to medically suppress estrogen to starve the lesions, right? Using GnRH agonists like Leuprolide or Lupron.
Exactly. It induces a temporary medical menopause.
Wait, putting a 20-year-old into menopause, isn't trabecular bone loss a massive risk there?
It absolutely is. That's a huge risk. And that is exactly why treatment is limited to just 6 months, and it requires strict bone mineral density monitoring.
Okay, that makes sense. I know the text briefly mentions danazol, but that's rarely used now because of androgenic side effects, like a deepening voice and hirsutism.
Right, you'll see continuous OCPs used more often. And surgically, a total abdominal hysterectomy with bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy, so TAH with BSO, is the only definitive cure for those not wishing to preserve fertility.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. While endometriosis causes cyclic pain, nurses also have to assess bleeding that doesn't follow the normal cycle rules. So how can a nursing student practically memorize and use the PALM-COEIN acronym?
It's a great framework. PALM represents the structural causes. So P is for polyp, A is for adenomyosis, L is for leiomyoma, which are fibroids, and M is for malignancy.
Okay, and COEIN represents the non-structural causes.
Right. C is coagulopathy, O is ovulatory dysfunction, E is an endometrial, I is iatrogenic, and N is not classified.
Got it. And within that, we see things like middle staining, which is just normal ovulation spotting, or OCP breakthrough bleeding.
Yeah, but the most critical presentation is heavy menstrual bleeding, which is often caused by uterine leiomyomas, or fibroids.
And those affect a huge portion of the population, right? Greater than 80% of Black women will develop them by age 50.
Yes. And for the nursing assessment here, you must rely on objective data. You always check the hemoglobin and hematocrit to quantify the actual blood loss.
Because subjective reports aren't enough, and treatments for that range from NSAIDs and GnRH agonists all the way to uterine artery embolization or myomectomy.
Exactly.
So we've spent this deep dive managing the reproductive years, but eventually the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis winds down. How does a nurse manage the great transition into menopause?
Well, clinically, menopause is defined strictly in retrospect as 12 consecutive months of amenorrhea. The mean age is 51.
But the perimenopausal transition takes 4 to 8 years, right? Where the ovarian follicles become less sensitive to FSH and LH.
Right, which leads to ovulatory cycles and wildly fluctuating estrogen levels.
And those physical changes are intense. There's genitourinary syndrome, where vaginal atrophy and a rising pH lead to UTIs and dyspareunia.
And vasomotor instability, which brings on those classic hot flashes or flushes and night sweats.
So what does this all mean for the patient's daily life and their mental health?
It's a brutal cascade. The night sweats lead to severe sleep deprivation, and that triggers mood swings, extreme fatigue, and cognitive issues.
And the cultural nursing assessment is so key here, right? How the patient views menopause as a loss of youth versus a transition into freedom and wisdom drastically affects their coping mechanisms.
Absolutely. You have to assess their cultural lens. But we also have to look at the major physical health risks.
Right, like osteoporosis. Figure 6.3 shows those skeletal changes and the dowager's hump. Why exactly does dropping estrogen destroy bone?
Well, estrogen stimulates osteoblasts, which are the bone builders. Without it, the osteoclast activity, the bone resorption, just takes over unchecked.
And diagnosis requires a T-score of -2.5 or lower, right?
Yes. And the other massive risk is coronary heart disease, which is the leading cause of death for U.S. women. Estrogen previously kept their HDL high and LDL low, but menopause reverses that lipid profile.
Knowing those risks, how do nurses safely administer menopausal hormone therapy, or MHT, and educate patients to protect their quality of life?
The clinical guidelines are incredibly strict. You use the lowest effective dose for the shortest possible time. Ideally, you start before age 60 and within 10 years of menopause onset.
Okay, looking at the medication summaries in Table 6.4, how do you choose a regimen?
The golden rule is, if a woman has a uterus, she must have progesterone added to her estrogen. Unopposed estrogen will cause endometrial cancer.
But if she's had a hysterectomy, estrogen alone is fine.
Exactly. And transdermal patches bypass the liver, reducing some side effects, while local vaginal creams are best if they just have isolated genitourinary symptoms.
What about the trend of custom compounded bioidentical hormones? People talk about them constantly online.
That requires a strong clinical warning. These lack FDA approval, they lack standardization, and they lack safety data. It's a major risk factor nurses must warn patients about.
Wow, okay. And for osteoporosis pharmacology, the text reviews bisphosphonates like alendronate.
Yes, but there is a vital medication alert here.
Right, a massive red flag nursing intervention for the exam. Bisphosphonates must be taken on an empty stomach with 6 to 8 ounces of plain water.
And they must sit perfectly upright for 30 minutes after taking it.
Wait, they can't even recline?
No, absolutely not. If they lie down, it causes severe esophageal ulceration.
Good to know. Let's rapid fire summarize the teaching for self-management box before we close.
Sure. Layered wicking clothing is great for hot flashes. Avoid triggers like spicy food and red wine.
Engage in weight-bearing exercises. Use silicone or water-based lubricants for dyspareunia, but never petroleum jelly.
And maintain strict nutritional intake. 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium and 600 to 800 IU of vitamin D.
Amazing. We have synthesized quite the journey today. From establishing the baseline of menarche, managing the pain and bleeding disorders of the reproductive years, all the way to safely guiding a patient through the physiological shifts of menopause.
It's a lot of ground to cover for sure.
But understanding the why behind the physiology naturally leads to accurate, prioritized nursing care.
Exactly. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. The female body is incredibly adaptive, but it requires us to listen closely to its signal.
Which raises an important question for future practice, right?
It really does. How much of what society dismisses as just normal aging or normal women's pain is actually a clinical symptom that a sharp nurse can safely manage and improve?
That is such a powerful perspective to take into clinicals. Well, to you, the nursing student listening right now, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. On behalf of everyone here and the Last Minute Lecture team, good luck on your exam. You're going to do great.